going to start the second half of the program with our second featured speaker, Alan Nelson. Alan is a professor at University of Washington. He has, I believe, 129 patents. Is that close? 139? Okay, I wasn't too far off. And he's been a proponent and user of AI for decades. And he's here in part to show you that AI has been around. It's not just a new phenomenon. His current work is in AI-driven cancer detection. He sold one company to Becton Dickinson. This is all in the bio, but I just thought I'd remind you. But this topic is AI-driven early cancer detection, opportunities and challenges. And he's going to talk about healthcare. Alan, take it away.
Thank you, Bruce. And I'm delighted to be here and address this wonderful team of people. Bruce told me don't show slides, so there'll be no PowerPoints here. He didn't tell me he was going to put up that slide, otherwise I would have updated the photo. So let me just tell you that the intersection of IP and AI, and then add the FDA into the mix, does cause gray hair. It happens very quickly. And as another anecdote, in those days, I used to play rock and roll, actually rock and roll blues. And to this day, I had to change the name of the band. And it's all a bunch of attorneys and other people in the band. So we call ourselves the Gray Matters. So let me talk to you about what I've learned. I hope to provide some guidance, address some questions along the way. And I'm going to tell you some war stories. And then I'm going to try to relate that to a few things other people said. But I'm involved in cancer diagnosis. I'm a physicist by training and have used AI with no glamour, not even called AI, for decades to improve the accuracy of diagnosis of cancers. And what's not on my resume is that it started with breast cancer, moved to cervical cancer, and then to lung cancer. And I'm going to give you the saga, if you will, of how all of that works, including the challenges along the way, both with the Patent and Trademark Office, although I have to say, and for Jerry's benefit, they've been absolutely heroic during this time, and we came at a time when the patent examiners themselves weren't really fully briefed on the evolution of AI and what sorts of inventiveness might occur in that space. So we've been all kind of learning about this together. But I think this tidal wave of AI in healthcare is coming faster and bigger than most people appreciate. I also call it a tidal wave because it's going to hit shore sometime soon, and to some extent there's going to be some panic around that. And what I'm going to talk to you about is panic around human experts as well. That sort of comes with the territory. So by way of background, this intersection involving cancer diagnosis is in some ways quite the opposite of generative AI. I actually just learned about that at this conference. So this is AI for diagnostic purposes. And that means there are data inputs. In my case, our companies invent and control the data source, which we now appreciate has a lot to do with our patentability, even though we use those data sources and the data is produced by those data sources in AI systems to provide prediction of healthcare outcomes. And I suppose I should start with a company, not the breast cancer company. I'm going to move on to the cervical cancer company. This company developed a machine to screen cervical cancer. We got 83 patents on that machine. It had a lot of new technologies that made it an amazing data source, repeatable, accurate, everything to go with that. But with that was the challenge of making it commercially viable, which, to shorten the story, meant we had to make it really, really fast to get pap smears screened swiftly. In fact, the economic goal of the machine was to screen 300 pap smears in a day. And that's a blindingly fast task. Somebody mentioned terabytes of data. Well, in a day, these machines would collect multiple terabytes of data from 300 pap smears. So it became a massive, massive data problem, but the machine had some uniqueness to it, which began our patent pursuits, and then that ultimately led to the FDA, and I have to tie the FDA into this because none of these diagnostic technologies using AI, and I think Armando said this, will get to the market if you don't deal with the FDA. It's absolutely correct. And so we first went to the FDA with this new pap smear screening theory, and we said, what do we need to do for clinical trials to satisfy the FDA that you could approve a machine that reads a pap smear? This came at a time historically, many of you are too young to even know about this, when pap smears were viewed as the number one reason why the death rate from cervical cancer was dramatically reduced in the United States. In many countries, it still remains the number one killer of women. And once upon a time in the US, it was the number one killer, but not today. In fact, it's way down on the risk side of cancer killers. And so how do you improve on the pap smear? Well, Dr. Papanicolaou essentially invented the pap smear at Columbia University. He started perfecting the science of a pathologist reviewing a pap smear in the 40s, and then it became standard of care in the 50s. And if you think about it, the woman's cervix is scraped. The scrapings, which include a lot of cells, are buttered onto a glass slide, and the glass slide is viewed in a microscope, and a very well-trained pathologist, sometimes including a cytotechnologist, review that pap smear for cellular evidence of cervical cancer, and it works. So how can you improve on that? Those doctors have a false negative rate. And the genesis of my first company was a bunch of attorneys who came to say, Al, what can you do about this litigation that's occurring when women discover 2 or 3 years after they had a pap smear that was reported as normal, that in fact they have invasive cervical cancer, and it's a very serious problem and a risk to their lives. And they're suing. And then you get doctors as expert witnesses going to court, expert witnesses against the original pathologist who say, I don't know how the pathologist missed it, but I can see it. In other words, the evidence was there, and they didn't see it, and every case is lost. I mean, it's a nightmare. But that aside, the real nightmare is what it did to women. And false negatives are not tolerated. I would say I have a rule. It'll never be tolerated, but it's natural. And so you bring to bear the best technology you can. And these attorneys said, Alec, you start a company that will improve on the pap smear, dealing with the terrible false negative rate and the consequences of that. And the answer was, I'll give it a shot. Very naively, give it a shot. Technology, I thought we could do. What I didn't appreciate was getting it approved by the FDA. And there were a few interesting issues that occurred with the Patent and Trademark Office along the way. So here begins the story. The FDA started by, unfortunately I went and talked to them before we got too far into this, although most of my funders were good venture capitalists, important ones that you all know, like NEA. The FDA said that you have to be equivalent to the human pathologist. And I said, I understand that, but I think we'll be better. And they said, you can't be better. They're the gold standard. Well, as a scientist, you stop and you say, we have an issue right here and there. What do you mean they're the gold standard? I know that. But do you think the gold standard means perfection? I beg to differ. The gold standard makes mistakes. And the FDA then said, well, that may be the case, but we regulate your technology and we will regulate your machine, we'll approve it or not approve it, and we don't regulate the doctor. And they are the gold standard. And so, by the way, you're not allowed to just be equivalent. You'll have to be better. Okay, we'll be better than the doctor. How much better? We didn't get an answer. Okay, so we accepted that. We were going to be better than the doctor. To do that, we had to build an AI system trained by doctors. So the AI system had the benefit of the best cytopathologists in the country. Actually, there were 10 of them. One of them was right here in Chicago, George Weed, who was a trainer in this machine, bringing up this whole notion of if the AI contains the brain matter of all these pathologists, do we even own it? And that created issues with tech transfer for some of the professors who worked in universities, whose university said, you can't just drain our faculty's brains and put that in a product and put it out there. And we struggled with that, but we won all the arguments, and thus things proceeded. But along the way, the FDA, we would touch base with the FDA and say, we're going to make this economically viable, we have to scan these pap smears really fast. So we're going to do some random sampling of this glass slide that contains cells. And we proved to the FDA that works. Random sampling works because why? The cells are distributed somewhat randomly in the first place. But then the FDA changed its mind after we were well down the development path and said, you know what? Random sampling is not acceptable. You have to look at every single cell on the pap smear. That increased the challenge by an order of magnitude. To build a commercial company, we had to build something that could scan slides faster than anything. Not only that, we had to compute the data faster than anything at that time. And so this is my tribute to Alex. Is he here? Alex, don't. He's not here. Oh, he had to leave. Well, now he doesn't get the benefit of this because it's my Formula One analysis. And it's this. One of our first inventions in the USPTO was a machine that scanned so fast that it collected data before the image was created as it moved swiftly down the path. And if you imagine a focal plane moving along a glass slide, it's not, the glass is flat, but the cells are not. They go up and down, and that means we have to adjust focus fast. It's not a straight scan. And the argument that I gave to the patent office when we said we actually need to look backwards to see left and right where we've been, to figure out where we should go before we get there, so that by the time the data comes out, the image is taken and processed, we can take the next step. In other words, computation and image collection was not fast enough to move along at the speed of scanning that was required. As a result, two things happened. We built a Formula One race car in the following sense, had two rear view mirrors. And it's kind of like if you're a Formula One driver, somebody puts a black wall on your windshield. But you get to look in the left and right mirror, and you know the layout of the racetrack that Alex showed. And let's assume that there are no cliffs. Yes, there are walls on the side, but not in the middle of the road, and there are no other cars. And in that sense, you can look backwards and travel forward, monitoring where's the road behind you, and figure out where you should be next. You actually drive the course that way, never looking forward. So we actually patented that, And to explain it all, I went and gave my first lecture at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office about Formula One driving, and we're going to blacken the windshield and look at left and right mirrors, and we're going to look behind, and we'll gather data, and we'll know where to go next. And oh, by the way, we're going to put a brick on the gas pedal. This thing is going to go really fast. And it did. But then, the next challenge that brings in another federal group is that there were no GPUs at the time. There were no NVIDIAs, no GeForces. We had to build our own high-speed computing. That otherwise would have required a fast link to Lawrence Livermore Laboratory to a supercomputer. And we couldn't figure out how to make that work economically, so we had to build a new chip, so-called ASIC, Application-Specific Integrated Circuit. These things were 2 inches in diameter. We designed them, and Intel built them. They went on our boards. We called them field of view computers, and we applied for patents on that. Next part of the story, if Jerry's here, maybe he'll comment later, but we didn't even get an office action on our chip design. We got raided by the federal government. So I'm in my office, and the front desk calls and said, there are 4 gentlemen here in suits, and they're demanding to see you. I said, do they have an appointment? And she said, they're packing. And I said, what? Packing what? She said, I said, oh my God, call the police. And she said, that's the 4th person. That's like, I don't believe this. We got locked down by the federal government. The CIA, the police, and the FBI raided our company because of the chip technology. And they could only have known about that because we applied for a patent. Everything else was confidential. I mean, I don't know how this works. I still don't know. And nevertheless, there they were, and we had a lockdown for 4 days. We were allowed to bring in pizza. We couldn't go home. We couldn't shave. We weren't really ready for that. And they brought in lots of experts. And at the end of the story, we were forbidden to export. And because we had certain controls around the software that limited the application to healthcare, we were allowed in a limited way to go forward with government march-in rights at any time should the federal government want to take our technology and move from there. All right, well, I'm belaboring this story. It's a war story in a way, but we're learning a lot in our interaction with the Patent and Trademark Office. One thing is they somehow connect up with people in the know in the federal government outside the patent office, and I still don't know how that works. Twice we had to go give lectures to the PTO about this interface of data collection and AI, which was not called AI then. I mentioned before it was called fuzzy logic binary tree classification machine vision, but AI. And it was trained by the best doctors on the planet. And now we get to the FDA, who reminded us that it has to be better than a doctor. And oh, by the way, how can you prove that? So our clinical trial was over 20,000 women. You can get a drug approved on a clinical trial with 100 patients. This is a diagnostic, 20,000 patients. Are you kidding? And thanks to Kaiser Permanente, we had the opportunity to do that number of patients. And then when we got to the FDA, they said, doctors are going to fear that you're going to replace them. And I said, maybe we should, because this is better than the doctor. And they make mistakes, and those mistakes cost women's lives. And the FDA said, that will never fly. And so they said, we won't let you do that, but we'll let you do a second read on all the pap smears that were previously read by the doctor. And oh, by the way, you don't report that outside, you report it inside, so that they can correct their evaluation, so the woman never knows that the doctor made a mistake if they embrace the technology, and the technology double screens, fixes the problem, and now you get a correct result. That was called QC. The problem with QC is now you've increased the cost of a pap smear because it's additive, so the economics get trashed. Fortunately, Blue Cross Blue Shield saw that coming and saw the reduction in health care and came to the rescue and said, we'll raise the reimbursement for pap smears. And that gave us a little tiny bit of a margin. But I would say the FDA was not working with us in all of this. And this machine was capable of doing a diagnosis more accurately, more consistently than the 10 pathologists who trained it. And so we always had that in our back pocket, and that was our original plan. And the FDA let us emerge as a QC device, which we did. Kaiser Permanente was the first customer. But right behind that, we then applied to the FDA for primary screening of pap smears, where it ought to be, up front, first thing. And we went to, this was a class 3 PMA. We went to a panel hearing, and we showed up, my entourage of clinical partners and statisticians, including Kaiser Permanente. And it was going to be a bad day because we had to cross a picket line in front of the FDA. I mean, who ever heard of that? I never heard of that. Like France, cafeteria workers. So we crossed the picket line, and I noticed as we went across, a sign said, we pathologists do not want to see this technology approved, we'll lose our job. I thought, oh no, this is not good. We get to the FDA, panel hearing consists of 20 pathologists who also maybe were in the picket line and then rushed on in to sit on the panel. And we presented the most remarkable proof that this machine was better than any pathologist any day, unless that pathologist got lucky that day. And we were denied approval. I had already taken the company public, our stock plummeted, the economic loss was horrendous. All the news was there, broadcasting, FDA denies approval of this company. And the panelists are required by law to provide guidance to the company that failed to get approval to be positive, constructive, help them get things straight. And the chairman of the panel went around and 20 pathologists, I felt like I was in the Lion Arena, and they just all did this. And the chairman said, I need verbal, how can I, put in the federal record? Thumbs down, other than the words, but I need commentary. And finally, our only comment came from a pathologist who said, we encourage the company to go do clinical trials that take a long, very long time, quote unquote. And I thought, that's not scientific, that just is fear of a technology. I don't get this. How do we combat that? I went back to my board and they said, well, we'll just have to spend shareholder money and do a lot more clinical trials. My comment was, that's not the point. We already proved the science. So how can we prove it more? And more science? we already had statistical proof. And to end that story, move on from there, Maria Cantwell in the state of Washington got on our side, and then Patty Murray, who was the senator at that time, agreed to take me to Capitol Hill and introduce me to all of the women in Congress and all the doctors in Congress and tell my story. What resulted was a letter from Congress to the commissioner, Dr. Eschenbach of the FDA, saying the following: we're the Congress. We've heard a story about a technology that was denied approval, and we have great respect for the FDA. The FDA is our guardian on good health care. We're not even questioning that. However, we do control your budget. And if we learn that this technology was disapproved for any reason other than scientific, here's the clincher, we will hold you, Mr. Commissioner, and every person on that FDA panel personally responsible for every woman who suffers as a result of a false negative until you approve this technology, if it's approvable. That got somebody's attention. We got a FedEx approval letter overnight from the commissioner that said the advisory panel is just that, advisory. But we knew we were going to have a market problem. And thus we continued to struggle because pathologists didn't want to see this technology adopted. However, Becton Dickinson then bought our company, and happily they took that technology everywhere in the world. And in China, for example, women never got pap smear screening, and China's excuse was, we don't have physicians trained to even read pap smears. Now they have no excuse, they have a machine that does it. And guess what? Pap smear screening started in China for the first time. And it started at the National Cancer Institute in Beijing, and they do it all by machine. And this technology became worldwide standard of care. So the next part of my story goes from there, and then I'll try to be mindful of the time, but Bruce said I could have a little extra time. And that is this. Becton Dickinson bought our company, and they put me into golden handcuffs for a year. I couldn't pirate. I couldn't do anything other than help transfer the technology to Becton Dickinson. But I was done in 4 months and kind of bored. And so I thought on day 366, I'm going to hire the same team back and we'll do it all over again. That's exactly what I did, and I let BD know we were going to do that. And their only warning was don't infringe our patents. And I thought, that's easy. Because my team are all the inventors on those patents. We will not do that. We're promised, and if you're okay with that. And they said, because if you do, we'll be on it. We'll sue you. We'll defend those patents. And I understood that. And so that meant that when we enter the next phase, which is to screen for lung cancer, that we can't duplicate any of that technology. So now I have an interesting story for you related to that. You may not know that in 1984, a fellow named Edwin Abbott wrote a book called Flatland. Anybody read that book? Don't tell me you never heard of it. We've got one Flatlander here. Well, not really, but you read the book. Flatland is about a civilization that lives in spatial 2 dimensions. The reason I bring that up is because pap smears live in spatial 2 dimensions. So does biopsy. If you think about it, tissue biopsy. You slice it up like a loaf of bread. You have a 2-dimensional slice. Put it on a glass slide. It's a flat surface. It's 2-dimensional. And then you look at it with a microscope that has a focal plane. That's also 2-dimensional. So 3 layers of 2D. And a worse problem in physics is that the more you want to see in resolution on a focal plane, the thinner the focal plane. The more you see in the plane, the less you see out of the plane. And shockingly, pathologists have never seen a cell in true 3D. And yet, they make a cancer diagnosis. And you think about it. It's always done with a 2D instrument and a very limited 2D view of the cell. So just imagine what they might be able to do if they could see cells in 3D. They understand them in 3D, but they never see them in 3D. So we said we're going to invent a 3D imaging system that sees cells in 3D, and we will not infringe the BD patents because that was all 2D-based glass slide screening, and we'll invent something new and different. And the analogy for us that we all take for granted today is X-ray CT, where before 1970, chest X-rays were 2-dimensional. Fluoroscopy was 2-dimensional. All of a sudden, you get an X-ray CT machine that takes a bunch of images around your anatomy, computes your 3D anatomy, and voila, you have 3D anatomy all of a sudden for the first time, except for the Da Vinci's who took people apart surgically all the time. But this is the first time that a radiologist now gets a real view, 3D, without dissecting a human, to locate tumors, understand tumors, and everything else. So we wanted to do that, but in pathology you have to use optics. And X-ray CT machines use X-rays that don't see cells, because the wavelength is too short, it does blast right through cells, you see nothing. So you have to go to optics. And there's a nasty problem with optics, and that is that microscopes have focal planes. The same thing I told you about that limits the view to 2D. And we had to invent a microscope that did not have a focal plane. And my physics colleagues said to me, Alan, you can't do that. It violates the laws of physics. And I said, we're after the world's #1 cancer killer, lung cancer. We're just going to have to violate the laws of physics. And we did it. The first 3 patents are about how you build a microscope with no focal plane. This again required us going to the patent office to provide lectures to examiners to understand this new space. And something magical happened. Instead of getting comments from examiners that limited our claims, there was always some component of that, we got examiner comments that said, all well and good, but did you think about this? You could have expanded this claim. We said, whoa, I've never seen that before. We could expand the claim? Oh, let's go for it. Well, we don't see any prior art there, but you need to research, et cetera. So we would reconstruct our claims and expand them. And then we got on the Cancer Moonshot program. And I never knew how that worked. But now we get our patents issued in 12 to 18 months from the time we submit our application. Within 2 months, we've already heard from an examiner, and the interaction proceeds, and we get closure, and we get a granted patent that the rest of my colleagues are envious about, because they wait sometimes 3 or 4 years. So I don't know how that works. I asked Jerry. It seems like we go to the front of the line, the examiner cleans the desk and goes right to work on our patents. There's something there. Now I've found out that the Moonshot program also requires the FDA and other government agencies to prioritize what we're trying to do. And you'll be amused when I say the following, that while we had to do Class 3 PMA for my pap smear screening machine, that's terribly expensive, over 20,000 patients. By the way, at the time, it was the largest clinical trial ever in the United States to just improve the pap smear. I feared the next statement, which would be Class 3 PMA, lung cancer, et cetera. And they said, no, this time around, and I think there's been a generational change at the FDA. Did you know that there's a predicate company that did this before and will allow you to be a 510K predicated on this prior approval on a device, which was my company's device, for pap smears. And they don't even know I'm the same person, because they're not even the same generation. But hallelujah, now we're Class 2, 510K, to get approval on this device, and it will be better than anything you've ever seen. And just to tell you, it's based on a sputum collection, deep cough from your lungs, and when you do that, you produce, on average, 1 million cells, plus or minus 500,000 from your lungs. We analyze all those really fast, but the trick is the cancer cells are very, very rare. And the difference between there and a pap smear is a cervical scrape, you're scraping the lesion, and the cervical cancer cells are not rare. And now we have a problem where the cells are so rare, 1 in 10 million sometimes, that we have to have a completely different technology to do that. We envisioned that 3D cell imaging would solve the problem, and it did. And we published it, it solved the problem. And we have today 94% sensitivity to stage 1 lung cancer that is curable by surgery alone. No chemotherapy, no radiation therapy. Stage 1 lung cancer that has no symptoms. Along the way, we're fortifying our patent portfolio. We're getting now patents on AI. It's not called fuzzy logic anymore. And it is called AI, and I'm happy to report last week we got a patent issued called AI-based cell analysis system and method. It's huge. And the reason we got it is because we control the data source. It's unique to us, and we patented that. And so to do a 3D cell, you have to have our kind of data that goes into it. So it's a mix of the data source and then the algorithms that extract the diagnostic information from that data source. But I can tell you that 3D cell analysis is required, and 94% sensitivity to stage 1A lung cancer that has no symptoms, that can be cured by surgery alone, is going to change everything. It will change everything, in my opinion, if we're commercially successful, for the world's #1 cancer killer. So we always now look, I have 2 minutes total for questions? Oh, okay. So I always look at the field of technology development, AI, where humans are the expert training the system, in this case, the pathologists, and how you do this commercially, but that requires how do you get through the FDA. And the FDA is a very important part of this whole equation. It's essential to figure out how do you navigate the FDA. I guess the last thing I want to tell you in the patent front is that there was a time before the birth of AI, so to speak, that the FDA was very skeptical about artificial neural networks, which at my time back then were chips. Now they're algorithms, but there were chip designs that were neural networks. And the FDA said that's a problem too. We'll never approve a neural network, artificial neural network, to diagnose oncology. Are you kidding? And the reason is that because if something goes wrong, we can't fix it. We can't find the decision path that got from data input to data output. We can't define it. And because we happened to meet with the FDA about that, we never went down the path of artificial neural networks. We had very transparent data binary tree classifiers, albeit hard to look at because they had thousands of layers in them, but you could still trace them, and that was approvable. And as an anecdote, our one and only competitor didn't have that conversation with the FDA. They used artificial neural networks, and they bankrupted, and I bought them out of bankruptcy court just because I could then control all the pieces, including the IP. So I think in healthcare diagnostics, it will continue to be a challenge, but I think somebody said 10 years before you really see the impact. I think it's going to come a lot faster than that. And that, especially I can say in the case of lung cancer, those machines will be diagnosing lung cancer. And our clinical study leader is Dr. Ankit Barant at Northwestern Medical, who's a thoracic surgeon, and I'm pleased to say I'll be back here repeatedly. Thank you.